Have you ever felt like you were being watched but knew no one was there? This is the story of a night shift that turned into a nightmare. On the surface, it was an ordinary night, quiet, uneventful. Just another routine shift in a corporate office building. Everything seemed still, predictable. But beneath the surface, something far more unsettling was at play. It began with a sound, a faint creak, almost too subtle to notice. Something you could easily dismiss. But for the person who heard it, that sound carried a weight. A warning, perhaps, though they didn't know it yet. There were signs, small, seemingly inconsequential. A moment of static, a feeling of unease, the sense that something was off. They tried to shake it off, rationalize it. But the truth was already creeping closer, even as they sat there, unaware of what was coming. What happened next would defy all explanation. It was a quiet, foggy night in the middle of nowhere. The kind of night where even the stars seemed hesitant to shine. The factory stood alone, surrounded by fields of emptiness that stretched as far as the eye could imagine. The fluorescent lights inside hummed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, casting a sterile glow on the concrete floors below. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of machines echoed, a sound so consistent it almost blended into silence. The building itself was sprawling, a labyrinth of hallways and production floors, all eerily deserted. No coworkers to chat with, no friendly faces to break the monotony. Just one person, stationed at the far end of the facility, tasked with overseeing operations through the long hours of the night. They had been here before, countless times, and nothing ever happened. The few security cameras placed around the premises were old and unreliable, flickering in and out as if they were as tired as the person watching them. The isolation was palpable, a silence so profound it felt like the world outside had disappeared altogether. But tonight felt different. It was hard to say why. Maybe it was the fog outside, so thick it seemed to press against the windows, distorting the view. Or maybe it was the subtle shift in the air, a feeling more than anything else that something was slightly off. Routine tasks were carried out mechanically. Walking the same halls, checking the same equipment, and logging the same reports. And yet, every now and then, there was a pause, a hesitation, as if the very walls of the building were holding their breath. Somewhere deep within the factory, there was a sound. Not the steady rumble of machines, but something sharper, fainter. A noise so unexpected it cut through the stillness like a blade. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to stop them in their tracks. It wasn't much, just the kind of sound you could dismiss as pipes settling, or maybe a draft. But it lingered, and then it was gone. At first, they told themselves it was nothing, just the building, old, creaky, unpredictable. But as the minutes stretched on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. They found themselves glancing over their shoulder, their eyes darting to the dimly lit corners of the room. The silence now felt oppressive, heavy, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. Then came the cameras, the grainy, flickering screens that monitored the factory's lifeless halls. They scanned each one, their eyes methodically moving from feed to feed, but nothing was there. No movement, no shadows, nothing out of place. And yet there was a nagging feeling, a sense that something or someone was just out of view, watching, waiting. This was the kind of night that made you question everything. Every sound, every shadow, every fleeting thought that crossed your mind. Alone, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by walls that seemed to close in a little tighter with each passing hour. And then, just as they began to convince themselves it was all in their head, it happened again. The sound. Closer this time. Louder. It wasn't a creak or a draft. It was deliberate, purposeful. A noise that sent a chill down their spine. They turned slowly, their heart pounding in their chest. The hallway behind them stretched out into darkness, the dim lights barely illuminating the path ahead. They called out, a hesitant, shaky voice that echoed back to them in a way that felt wrong. Too hollow, too empty. But no answer came. Only silence. The lone worker that night wasn't a stranger to isolation. They were used to the quiet, to the long hours spent in an empty building while the rest of the world slept. For them, it was just another shift, another night of mundane tasks and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. They were a security guard, the kind of person most people never notice. but they carried the weight of responsibilities far greater than the badge they wore. A single parent juggling 2 jobs just to keep the bills paid. They'd taken the night shift because it paid a little extra, money they desperately needed to keep the lights on and food on the table. I wasn't even supposed to be here that night, they'd later admit, but the thought of the extra paycheck kept me going. I figured one more night wouldn't hurt. The decision had seemed simple enough at the time. A coworker called out sick, and they'd agreed to cover. After all, what harm could it do? They'd worked this shift countless times before. Nothing ever happened. Nothing ever changed. But this night would be different. They'd always been the kind of person who kept their head down and did what needed to be done. A quiet resilience marked their days, and a deep sense of responsibility drove them forward. Life hadn't been kind, but they'd learned to endure, to push through, to survive. This job, though unremarkable to anyone else, was a lifeline for them. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fulfilling, but it paid the bills, and that was enough. Still, there were moments when the solitude of the job got to them. The endless nights spent walking empty halls, the silence so profound it felt like a presence in itself. They'd grown used to the feeling of being alone, but never completely comfortable with it. There was always a small part of them that couldn't shake the sense that they weren't truly alone. That night, though, the feeling was stronger, more persistent. They'd tried to ignore it, brushing it off as exhaustion or their imagination playing tricks on them. But as the hours dragged on, the unease gnawed at them, refusing to be ignored. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the lights, the faint buzz of the security cameras, the occasional creak of the building, it all felt sharper, more intentional. And then there was that noise, the one they couldn't explain, the one that seemed to follow them, no matter where they went. They told themselves it was nothing, just the building settling, just the wind outside, just anything but what their instincts were screaming at them to believe. But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. And as the minutes turned into hours, that sense of dread only grew stronger. They didn't want to be here. They wanted to be home, with their kid asleep in the next room and the world outside locked away. But life didn't offer them that kind of luxury. They'd made a promise to provide, no matter what. And so they stayed, even as every fiber of their being told them to leave. They didn't know it yet, but by the time the sun rose, everything would be different. That night would mark the beginning of something they'd spend the rest of their life trying to understand, trying to forget. As the night dragged on, they tried to settle into their routine. Routine was safe, predictable. It was the only way to push through the long, empty hours. But this night made it difficult to focus. Every little sound seemed magnified, every creak and groan of the building a jarring interruption to the silence. They tried to shake it off, forcing themselves to focus on the task at hand. It's just the wind, they thought. Or maybe I'm just tired. They hadn't been sleeping well lately. Night shifts did that to you, and the stress at home didn't help. Exhaustion had a way of playing tricks on your mind, but deep down, they knew it wasn't just exhaustion. Something felt different about this night. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. And then it happened. A faint sound echoed through the hallway behind them. It was barely audible at first, just a soft rhythmic tapping, like something brushing against the floor. They froze, straining to listen, their heart pounding in their chest. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. They let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously to themselves. It's nothing, probably just the wind. But even as they said it, the excuse felt hollow. The hallway behind them was enclosed, no windows, no drafts. Still, they forced themselves to move on, brushing off the unease. Minutes later, something caught their eye. A shadow, just at the edge of their vision. It was fleeting, barely there. A quick movement that disappeared the moment they turned to look. They froze again, scanning the empty hallway, their eyes darting from corner to corner. There was nothing, no movement, no sound. They shook their head, muttering under their breath. You're imagining things. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something or someone was watching them. Still, they pushed forward, determined to finish their rounds. But as they approached the break room, something stopped them in their tracks. On the table was a piece of paper, one they were certain hadn't been there before. Scrawled across it in shaky, uneven handwriting were 3 words, "Get out now." They stared at the note, their mind racing. Was this a prank? Had someone snuck in? The cameras would have picked it up, surely. But as they glanced at the monitors, their blood ran cold. The feed from the hallway outside the break room was static, nothing but a wall of gray and white noise. They reached for their walkie-talkie, their fingers trembling. But before they could speak, a deafening crash echoed through the building, the sound reverberating through the walls. It came from the far end of the factory, where the old storage rooms were, a place that hadn't been used in years. They froze, their heart pounding in their ears. For a moment, the silence was so complete it was suffocating. Then another sound broke through, a low, guttural noise, like a groan or a growl. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it was coming from the direction of the crash. They grabbed their flashlight, their hands shaking as they clicked it on. Slowly, they made their way toward the sound, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The closer they got, the colder the air seemed to grow. And then the lights began to flicker. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie crackled to life, a burst of static that made them jump. For a moment, there was nothing but garbled noise. Then a voice, low, distorted, and barely intelligible, spoke 2 words, "Turn around." They spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching out behind them. The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was their own breathing, quick and shallow. They reached for their phone, desperate to call for help. But as they unlocked it, the screen froze, glitching in and out before going black. And then, without warning, it began to ring. They stared at it, their hand trembling as they hesitated to answer. The caller ID was blank, just a series of dashes where the number should have been. Slowly, they pressed the button to accept the call, bringing the phone to their ear. But there was no voice on the other end, just static. And then, faintly, beneath the static, a sound that sent chills down their spine. A whisper. Their own name. They dropped the phone, the clatter echoing in the empty hallway. Their mind raced as they tried to make sense of what was happening. But deep down, they knew. This wasn't something they could explain. And it wasn't something they could escape. For a moment, they thought they had figured it out. They retraced their steps, piecing together the strange events of the night. The crash, the flickering lights, the distorted voices. It had to be something logical. Something they could explain. Perhaps a machine in the old storage area had malfunctioned. The place was filled with outdated equipment, after all. It wasn't impossible for something to shift or fall, causing the noise they'd heard. And the static on the cameras? Well, those were ancient too. Unreliable on the best of nights. They clung to this explanation, using it to push back the rising tide of fear. Armed with this newfound determination, they decided to investigate the source of the crash. If they could just find a broken machine or a fallen shelf, they'd prove to themselves that nothing unusual was happening. That everything could be explained. But as they approached the storage area, their confidence began to waver. The air grew colder with each step, their breath visible in the faint light of the flashlight. And then, they saw it. A pile of old equipment scattered across the floor, as though it had been knocked over. Relief washed over them. This is it, they thought. This is what caused the noise. They crouched down to examine the mess, their hands brushing against the cold, dusty metal. But then something caught their eye. A footprint. Bare, human, and impossibly fresh, pressed into the dust beside the scattered equipment. Their hearts sank as they realized they weren't alone. They stood up abruptly, the flashlight trembling in their hand. The shadows around them seemed to shift, growing longer and darker. And then, from the corner of their eye, they saw it again. The figure. This time it wasn't fleeting. It stood at the far end of the room, unmoving, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. But this time it was closer. They froze, their breath caught in their throat. The figure didn't move, it didn't speak, it simply stood there, watching. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows without a sound. Any sense of relief they'd felt moments ago was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a malfunctioning machine or a prank. This was something else, something they couldn't explain. As they stumbled out of the storage area, desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever they had just seen, they noticed something strange. On the wall near the door, there was a symbol, crudely drawn in what looked like dirt or ash. It was simple but unmistakable, a circle with a line running through it, bisected by two smaller lines, and at the center of the circle was something that made their stomach turn. Their initials, written in delicate, careful script. The sight stopped them in their tracks. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Whoever or whatever was behind this knew them. It knew who they were. Memories began to flood their mind, unbidden and unrelenting. The symbol, it seemed familiar, though they couldn't place it. And then they remembered. It was something they'd seen years ago, in an old notebook they'd found while cleaning out their father's attic. A notebook filled with strange symbols and cryptic notes about things they hadn't understood at the time. They'd written it off as the ramblings of an eccentric man. Their father had always been secretive, a little odd. But now, standing in that cold, empty factory, they realized it wasn't just a coincidence. This was connected to them, to their family, to a past they thought they'd left behind. They tried to calm themselves, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The figure, the note in the break room, the distorted voice on the phone. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, and it was aimed at them. As they turned to leave, desperate to get out of the building, the lights flickered once more. And then they heard it, a voice. Low, distorted, and impossibly close. It spoke their name, drawing it out like a whisper carried on the wind. They spun around, their flashlight scanning the darkness. But there was no one there. They weren't alone. They knew that now. And whatever was in the building with them wasn't just watching. It was waiting. The moment they decided to leave, the building seemed to respond. The air grew heavier, the faint hum of machinery drowned out by an oppressive silence. Each step they took felt labored, as if the very floor beneath them was trying to hold them in place. They gripped the flashlight tighter, its faint beam cutting through the darkness. Their mind raced, replaying every sound, every shadow, every inexplicable moment. Get out, they thought, just get out. But as they approached the nearest exit, a low, guttural noise froze them in their tracks. It was coming from behind them, deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. Slowly, they turned, the flashlight trembling in their hand. The beam swept across the empty hallway, catching only the faint outlines of doors and walls. But the noise continued, growing louder, more distinct, a sound that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. They had no choice. They had to know what was causing it. Against every instinct screaming at them to run, they began to move toward the source of the sound, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air growing colder with every passing second. The sound led them deeper into the building, down hallways they rarely visited, into parts of the factory that had been abandoned for years. The walls were lined with old, rusted equipment, their surfaces covered in dust and grime. And yet, as they moved further in, they noticed something strange. The dust on the floor had been disturbed, as though someone or something had walked through recently. They followed the trail, their heart pounding in their chest. The sound grew louder, more dissonant, like a chorus of whispers layered over each other. Their words unintelligible, but unmistakably human. And then they saw it. The figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. This time, it didn't vanish. It didn't move. It simply stood there, as though waiting for them. The flashlight beam faltered, the light flickering as it landed on the figure. For the first time, they could make out details. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured, its posture unnatural. It radiated an aura of malice, a presence so overwhelming it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. They stepped back instinctively, their breath quickening. But before they could turn and run, the lights in the hallway flickered violently, plunging them into darkness. The flashlight sputtered and died, leaving them in complete blackness. Panic set in. They fumbled with the flashlight, shaking it desperately, trying to coax it back to life. But it was no use. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, closing in from every direction. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the flashlight flickered back on. They backed away, their mind racing, every instinct screaming at them to run. But before they could move, a deafening crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming straight toward them. They turned and ran, their heart pounding in their chest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as they sprinted down the hallway. The footsteps followed, growing louder, closer, more insistent. No matter how fast they ran, the sound seemed to close the distance effortlessly, as though it wasn't bound by the same physical rules. They turned a corner, their breath ragged, their vision blurred with panic. And then they stopped. Dead ahead, blocking the only exit, was the figure. It stood motionless, its presence filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating energy. They realized then that there was no escape. The building wasn't just a place. It was a trap. A living, breathing entity that had lured them in and wouldn't let them go. The lights flickered one final time, and the whispers swelled into a deafening roar. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing like a drumbeat. And then, as it raised a hand, the flashlight died again, plunging them into total darkness. The darkness was absolute. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air was heavy, thick with an almost tangible fear, as if the building itself was alive and breathing. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on them like a weight. They stood frozen, paralyzed by the knowledge that the figure was still there, somewhere in the darkness, closer than ever. They could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to reach out and wrap itself around them. But survival instincts kicked in, overriding the fear. Their hand found the wall, using it as a guide as they stumbled forward, step by agonizing step. Their heart pounded in their chest, each beat echoing in their ears like a drum. They didn't know where they were going. All they knew was that they had to get out. Behind them, the sound of footsteps began again. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. They didn't dare look back. They couldn't. All that mattered was reaching the exit. And then, through the oppressive darkness, they saw it, a faint glimmer of light at the end of the hallway. The exit. They forced themselves to move faster, their legs trembling beneath them, their breath ragged. The footsteps behind them quickened, matching their pace, growing louder with each step. They reached the door and threw it open, the cold night air hitting them like a wave. They stumbled outside, collapsing onto the ground, their chest heaving as they gasped for breath. For a moment they felt safe, the oppressive presence of the building left behind. But as they pulled themselves to their feet, something compelled them to turn around, to look back at the building one last time. They wished they hadn't. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from inside, was the figure. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching them with a curiosity that sent chills down their spine. They didn't wait to see what it would do. They ran, their footsteps echoing into the night, but even as they left the building behind, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that the figure was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. I made it to the door, but as I looked back one last time, it was there, watching me. And I know, no matter how far I run, it always will be. They never spoke of that night again, not to their friends, not to their family. They filed a report about the strange occurrences, but no one believed them. The building was inspected and nothing unusual was found. No footprints, no writing on the walls, no signs of anyone else being there. But they knew the truth. They knew what they'd seen, what they'd felt. The figure, the whispers, the oppressive presence, it wasn't something that could be explained or rationalized. It was something beyond understanding. The nights that followed were restless, haunted by dreams of dark hallways and flickering lights. Every so often, when the house was quiet, they'd hear it again, that same faint whisper calling their name, and they'd feel it. The cold, unshakable sensation of being watched. I survived that night, but I left a part of myself behind in that building. And though I've moved on, every so often, I hear that same faint whisper, and I know it's still out there, waiting. And so, their story ends, or perhaps it only begins. A night that started as routine turned into something they would carry with them forever. A question they'd never truly find the answer to. But what about you? If you had been in their shoes, standing in that dark, oppressive hallway, what would you have done? Would you have kept searching for answers, or would you have run at the first sign that something wasn't right? Have you ever experienced something similar while working a night shift? A sound you couldn't explain, a shadow that seemed to move on its own, or a feeling that you weren't quite as alone as you thought? Night shifts have a way of stirring the imagination, don't they? We'd love to hear your stories. What strange, unexplainable moments have you experienced? Share them in the comments below. Who knows, your story might just be the next one we tell. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, sometimes the things we can't see are the ones watching us the closest. And that concludes tonight's story, a chilling reminder that the night holds secrets we may never fully understand. If this tale kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine how many more stories like this are out there, waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us bring you more unsettling tales like this. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss the next story that just might keep you up at night. This was just one of the many night shift horrors I've come across. The next one? Let's just say it'll make you question what's lurking in the shadows, even when you think you're safe. So, hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who loves a good scare, and let us know in the comments what you'd like to hear next. Who knows? Your suggestion might inspire our next terrifying tale. Until then, stay safe, keep the lights on, and remember, sometimes the dark is watching you too.